Hi, everyone. My name's Mac Ross, and I'm actually the chair of the board of directors at the Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Um, in my regular day-to-day life, I am a instructor at the University of Windsor in their sport management stream of their kinesiology program. So I do have quite an interest in sport and recreation, and today I'm actually going to talk to you about how to get a fishing license and some of the more complicated aspects of that here in Ontario, particularly in London. So, to get a fishing license in Ontario, first you have to purchase an outdoors card. This can be done online through the Government of Ontario, but you can also do it in a handful of spots right here in London, physical spots. So, the Springbank Mini Mart at 360 Springbank Drive has fishing licenses that you can buy or outdoor cards as well. The Service Ontario Centre at 100 Dundas Street and the Canadian Tire at 1125 Wellington Road. The other option is you can actually call 1-800 288 1155. So it gets a little complicated now. If you're a non-resident of Canada, and what they mean by that is you haven't lived in any Canadian province for 6 of the last 12 months, um, and you're over 18, you require an outdoor card and a fishing license to fish. If you're under 18, there is a little bit of wiggle room there. As long as you're fishing with somebody and you're a non resident and you're under the age of 18 and they have an outdoors card, you can count the fish you catch towards their limit of fish. So, say you're allowed to keep 6 of the fish that you're targeting that day. Let's say you're fishing for smallmouth bass. So, you're allowed to keep 6. If you catch 3 and you're under 18 and you're with somebody who has an outdoors card and they catch 3, you're done. That's 6 total. Because the person who is under 18 is a non resident, their total counts towards the total of the person who has the outdoors card. But it does still allow a person under the age of 18 who is a non resident to fish. If you're over 18 and under 65, you require a fishing license to fish in Ontario. If you are an Ontario resident or a Canadian resident, anyone who is under 18 or over 65 and is an Ontario resident or Canadian resident, and I'll explain what those are in a second in more detail according to the fishing regulations. It's different than other aspects of Canadian life. Um, you can go fishing as long as you carry government ID with you that proves your age. So proves you're under 18 or over 65. If you have a disability, you may fish without a license as long as you have your accessible parking permit with you to display to a conservation officer if they ask. The other interesting part of that is somebody can accompany you and assist you if you require that without a fishing license, so long as they don't fish themselves. If they're going to fish as well and they're accompanying you and helping you, they need a license as well. So, like I was saying, the licenses come from 3 categories: Canadian resident, Ontario resident, and non resident. A non resident, like I said, is somebody who hasn't lived in the country for 6 of the last 12 months. You are an Ontario resident if you've lived in Ontario specifically for 6 of the last 12 months prior to getting your license. You are a Canadian resident, according to the rules of these fishing regulations, if you've lived in Canada for 6 of the last 12 months, but not necessarily 6 of those months in Ontario. So this happened to me quite a bit because I was educated in 3 different provinces. So I moved from New Brunswick down to Nova Scotia up to Ontario. So every time I did that, I wasn't a provincial resident technically for the first 6 months. I was a Canadian resident in the eye of the fishing license folks. So when I moved to Ontario for the first 6 months, I was a Canadian resident. And then once I had been an Ontario resident, lived in Ontario for 6 months of the last 12 months, I could go get a license as an Ontario, excuse me, a resident. Uh, uh, So one other decision you'll have to make is whether you want a sport license or a conservation license. Sorry, I was coughing there for a bit, so we had to cut away. The sport license actually allows you to keep more fish. So you get the maximum limit size. If you buy a conservation license, you'll be allowed to keep less fish. I fish particularly for food, so I always go and get the sport license. But if you're primarily interested in it for recreation, obviously a conservation license might be fine. So you've got your license now. What where do you even get a fishing rod around here? Some of it doesn't necessarily make much sense. So, for example, Canadian Tire sounds like an automotive place. It is to some extent, but it sells a lot more than that, including a lot of fishing equipment. So, a lot of people in London, Ontario go to Canadian Tire to get their fishing equipment. Walmart also sells fishing equipment. Probably the most affordable stuff that you're going to find will be at Walmart. It will be of a little lesser quality, but it will last at least a couple of years. So you can get a good fishing rod for $20. If you want to get better equipment, it might take a little bit longer, but you can go on Facebook Marketplace, Value Village, Goodwill, go to yard sales, and you'll typically find nicer stuff for a lower price. It's just used. The other option is Dollarama, and I say that with some hesitation. They do sell their own reels for sure. They're only $5, I think. But I tried one because I wanted to see what a $5 reel was like and how long it would last. It lasted 2 trips for me. Of course, I have kids, so things get banged up a little bit. I do know some people who've had those reels for over a year, so that's pretty good for a $5 fishing reel. But my experience has not been that. It was 2 trips and it was broken. If you just really get into fishing and you want some nicer equipment, there are some specialist stores around town. There is Lambeth Rod and Tackle down in the southwest of the city. And then there's Angling Sport at Dundas and Highbury, which is another very nice shop. And they have some nicer stuff. They also have some affordable options as well, so it's worth going in even just to have a look someday. You can get rods and reels to come as a combo, so you don't have to try to match up the sizes or anything like that. The one piece of advice I would give you is get an open face spinning reel to start, especially if you're starting out new to fishing. The closed face spinning reels in particular are very prone to line tangles. I find they break quite easily. So especially if you're going to be going with kids and there'll be some wear and tear on the equipment, maybe consider an open face reel. Bait is very complicated. Basically, I think the best advice is to, be cautious. There's a lot of regulations around it. Our bait management zone, it's called, is specifically meant to help limit the spread of invasive species. It limits what types of fish we can use as live bait. So it encompasses 3 fisheries management zones, so 16, 17, 18. And we can travel in that area with our bait from where we live. If we go outside of where we live, we have to present a receipt to show where we got the bait from. If you're fishing outside of your bait management zone, and they can tell obviously by looking at your fishing license and your driver's license or what have you, you have to present a receipt for your live bait, at least your live bait fish. There's other regulations around the use of leeches and things like that that are worth looking up. We don't use those a lot around here, and I wouldn't suggest it. It's not necessary. But there are a lot of rules around transporting bait between what are called bait management zones. And the reason for that is if you're outside the zone with fish that are not native to that part of Ontario, there's a chance you could introduce it and it could have a pretty catastrophic effect on the ecosystem. And by showing the receipt, if you say that you bought those bait fish within that zone, all of a sudden, you can show that, well, a dealer sold them to me. I didn't just catch them. You're not allowed to catch bait from one zone and take it to another zone. You can show that the dealer sold it to you and you were under the impression that this was okay. And then, the conservation authorities will go up and have a chat with them. But it can be quite complicated. You can't dump any bait out within 30 meters of the shoreline for a few reasons. Obviously, invasive species again. You can't dump your bait fish into the water either. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them is just to be, respectful of other people using the territory around the river. When you leave bait on the shore and things like that, you attract scavengers like raccoons. And they can be quite territorial when they find something to eat. So for everybody's well-being, we try not to do that, especially with fish and cut bait and things like that. Things will find it fairly quickly. And of course, it starts to smell if it's a hot, sunny day and things like that. And it can ruin the nature experience for everybody, whether they're hiking or bird watching or not just fishing. In terms of fish species, there's a lot of different fish that you can target in the Thames River. I've had many really incredible days on the Thames River fishing for smallmouth bass. A lot of people fish for walleye, which are a highly sought after fish. And both will bite just worms. So you can buy worms all over town. You can buy them at the fishing stores I mentioned. You can buy them at not Walmart, but you can buy them at Canadian Tire. And there's kind of a little trick that a lot of fishermen know around town is you can also buy them at pet shops, because the pet shops sell reptiles, amphibians, things like that eat worms. They stock worms, and they're the same worms as you would get anywhere else. They work just as good. Often you can get them closer to your host that way. Sometimes they're a little bit more expensive, but it's something to keep in mind. And of course, you can get free worms. Worms are all over the place. You can get them out of your yard, your garden. If there's been a rain, they'll be all over the sidewalk. They'll be, in parking lots. You can gather them up yourself for free and not pay anything. That's what me and my son do. He's 8 years old. And that can be a lot of fun for kids too, just gathering up worms for bait. Sometimes they have more fun doing that than actually fishing. The other types of fish in the river really vary pretty dramatically between, fish you would catch kind of sitting still and putting a worm or bait on the bottom, and fish you would cast to. To catch things like walleye, smallmouth bass, northern pike, largemouth bass, things like that, you're going to have to move around a little bit. There's a lot of fishing pressure on those species, especially in the city, although there's a lot of them, so that helps. But if somebody's fished that spot earlier in the day before you got there, it can be tricky to get them to bite. So you have to kind of move up and down the shoreline. If you're trying to catch a full limit, so say 6 smallmouth bass, to have dinner that night, you're going to have to move around a little bit to catch 6. Not necessarily a really long distance, but smallmouth bass are quite territorial, and they tend to hang out in their own little spots. So although you can find plenty of videos of them kind of schooling up and things like that, but in my experience on the Thames River, you got to move up and down to catch a fair number of fish at any given day, especially for bass and pike and things like that. If you're fishing for carp, so this is a type of fishing where you're going to stay in the same spot, and you're going to do what we call chumming. You're not allowed to chum with anything that is animal-based. But carp, we primarily around here anyway use canned corn to catch carp, and you are allowed to chum the water, so throw it out there to try to attract the fish a little bit with corn, and it will work. They will come around, and once a few start eating, a few more will come, and you can have a lot of fun that way. And all you really have to do is put a little bit of corn on a hook with some weight on the bottom, but pay careful attention. I've already lost a fishing rod to a very large carp, taking my rod and running wild with it up the river. I'll never get it back. It was my favorite rod. So when you are fishing for them, you get lulled into a false sense of security because nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden you get a big bite, and you have to move pretty quickly to grab your rod. Um, Carp in the Thames can get up to like 10, 15 pounds. So they're quite large. There are even bigger ones. You occasionally see somebody post a picture that's really shocking of a very big carp. So they are probably one of the funner fish to catch because you can really find them in most spots on the river. You don't have to move around a lot. You can kind of relax. You can bait the area. It's a great fish to target if you're taking kids and you want them to try to catch something really big. The other fish like that is catfish, particularly channel catfish. Now, when you're fishing for channel catfish, you'll probably catch bullhead catfish as well. They're much smaller cousins. But channel catfish in the Thames River can get up to, typically between 4 and 8 pounds. They can get even bigger. They are quite a large fish. But for those, you typically fish with things like chicken liver, worms. You can use live bait as well. And they fight really hard, and they're very good eating fish, especially down in the United States. They do eat channel catfish quite a bit. It's less common up here in Canada, though people do it in London as well. There is a third species that you could catch called the flathead catfish. And they've just really started to come up the river as the water has warmed a bit, the climate has warmed a bit. They used to be only down kind of in the southern tributaries, rivers and streams of Lake Erie, but they've been coming up the Thames River in larger and larger numbers. And there have been a couple caught in London, at least one at the forks of the Thames and one at the kind of little dam behind Labatt's Brewery. So they're coming up. You'll know one if you catch it. They're called flathead for a reason. Their heads are very funny looking. They're very flat. Some people call them shovels because they look like a shovel. So unlike the other catfish, which kind of big bulky heads, these guys have very strange flat heads on them, and they'll stand out. And may take you a second to realize what it is, but eventually it becomes pretty obvious. The fish that have been caught here so far, in terms of flathead catfish, have been largely juveniles, not super big, but they can grow to be very large. So there's no way to know if that's going to happen in the Thames River. There's certainly enough food for them. So in the next few years, we may start to see that, but it's hard to say. Other fish, there's a large array of suckers, which are kind of bottom feeding fish that have a sucker shaped mouth that go along. Particularly in the spring, they'll run up the rivers, different types of what are called red horse. We have river red horse, shorthead red horse, a whole bunch, silver red horse, smallmouth buffalo, muskie, rainbow trout, brown trout, white bass, largemouth bass, yellow perch, white perch. You can see what I mean when I say it's a very diverse river. So especially if you're fishing with worms, you never really know what you're going to catch, which makes it very exciting because sometimes you catch something completely unexpected. One thing I would say with things like muskie, make sure you double check the regulations. They're pretty highly protected throughout Ontario. In London, they're very protected as well. So it's not like other fish. You can't keep them typically. If you are in an area where you are allowed to keep them in Ontario, there's usually quite a large limit put on it in terms of how long it must be in order to be allowed to keep it, in order to protect the stocks. So, and so the other thing about that is they look a lot like a northern pike. They're the same shape, but they have different colors. So you should probably be able to tell the difference just in case it does happen. Although they are very rarely caught this far up the river, maybe 1 or 2 a year, come all the way up into the city. The other thing I wanted to mention before I end off is that the places that are easiest to access for fishing are still very good. So most of the parks in town along the river are still excellent for fishing. Harris Park, Gibbons Park, places like that. You can spend money and go up to Fanshawe Lake. It's a great spot to fish as well. You can rent kayaks and canoes and things up there that can let you go out and have the lake fishing experience if you want that. If you want to fish with kids, there's fish called sunfish. We have a few different kinds around. There's pumpkin seed sunfish, which are beautiful, brilliant colored fish. We have bluegill, and the other one that we typically call sunfish is rock bass. You can catch these types of fish at a lot of the ponds around town. The one of the best is for pumpkin seed down at what's called the coves. So if you go to the coves and you look up the coves online and you can see where it is. It's just down off Springbank. It's almost every cast you can catch a little sunfish. So it's fantastic for kids. Down at Pond Mills you can catch bluegill. I believe there's some pumpkin seed in there. There's probably some rock bass. But there's also largemouth bass, pike, things like that. So another fish called crappie, which are very good eating. There's also crappie in the river. I've always had a really tough time finding them. So that makes it a little less interesting to target them specifically on the Thames River. But then you can also get down towards Lake Erie. Remember, check all the local regulations. Their regulations are slightly different than what's going on at the Thames River. And you can catch a whole variety of fish down there. You can take out a charter if you want to do that. So there's many opportunities to fish around town. I'm always more than happy to take somebody fishing. So if you're interested, please reach out to RRAI, and I will find the time to take you out and show you some places where you can catch some fish in London, Ontario. Because it is a wonderful way to spend a day. It's great exercise. You're moving around, you're out in nature, and hopefully you're catching some fish. Thank you.